So there are two major structural problems in the American Republic right now. The first is that we gave control over our entire information ecosystem to big technology companies that hate the values of the people in this room.
Yeah.
If you really want to have a free and fair election in 2024, the most important thing, break up Google. Break up Google and return power over the information economy to the American people. Just think about this. That's where 99% of people, regardless of their politics, get their information. We know now that it's completely dominated by left-wing radicals. It has a complete monopoly. I think it's illegal, by the way, to have that monopoly control over information. You go in and type in, did Donald Trump say such and such about immigration? Or is Joe Biden too old to be president of the United States? Well, the answer is yes, right? You don't need a Google search for that. But the results will be so biased and so corrupted in a left-wing direction. That's one of the reasons why we have major problems with our elections in this country.
If they do win this election and break Google and Facebook up, do you really think they will allow these algorithms to amplify black voices? Or would this be another avenue to suppress non-white male voices, pushing industrial era propaganda? Just as they suppressed us with affirmative action laws, they might seek to dominate the internet, enforcing their narratives around the world. If we could see most of the West's big businesses do this to Russia, what makes you think Pan-Africa cannot be targeted next?
Our sister platforms, which is an African platform called African Stream, of course, has been censored and has been removed from YouTube.
RT also secretly runs the online platform African Stream across a wide range of social media platforms. Now, according to the outlet's website, African Stream is, and I quote, a pan-African digital media organization based exclusively on social media platforms, focusing on giving a voice to all Africans both at home and abroad. In reality, the only voice it gives is to Kremlin propagandists.
They consider reparations a Kremlin view.
Oh.
They consider
They do.
the civil rights movement actually a Kremlin view. They consider racial disparities a Kremlin view. So these are Department of Defense talking points, and these are unfortunately the DNC talking points as well, which repeatedly tries to smear me as a Russian agent. Well, that was long put to rest by the Senate Intelligence Committee, which looked into that smear campaign for 3 years. Actually, I had a detailed investigation.
Africans are still made to look like servants, made to look like they still have masters, made to look like they are unable to have ideas and opinions of their own. Because African Stream is run by Africans my age, right? Run by Africans my age, sharing news that is not co-signed by the imperialists, right? And so for them, they can't fathom that people like us would be able to see through their propaganda. And so it just has to be the Kremlin. It just has to be Russia that's controlling us, that's telling us what to do, because we are not human. We are not smart enough. We're not there.
The reason why they did that is because Africans are supposed to be dumb. You're a bunch of muppets. That's what we are. We're a bunch of morons. You've been able to bamboozle guys for hundreds of years. And in the last 60, 70 years of alleged independence, you don't even have to deal with the public African, the regular African on the streets, because they're a bunch of lemmings. We can assassinate any of their leaders we feel like. They know it's happened. But then what are they going to do? They're going to say anything?
Is the assumption that somehow Africans in particular cannot think for themselves, and that the positions and feelings that people have all around the continent on whatever the issue may be, the war in Ukraine or the role of Russia and China in the world or whatever, is only happening because they're being secretly manipulated, which just seems massively paternalistic to me. But I wonder your thoughts on that question, David.
So I have two thoughts on that. The first is, I find that entire concept to be, in addition to being disgustingly racist, I find it incredibly offensive. Personally, I take it very personal because, so I work with African Stream. I know the amount of effort that we put into what we actually put out. I know the amount of fact checking we do. I know the amount of technical accomplishment it takes to actually put out a piece of content. coming on air to call us by name and basically reduce all of our hard work to Russian. He didn't even say they're funded by Russia or funded by RT. He said they're secretly run by RT, with the inference being that these guys are too stupid to even put out any of this stuff, to create any of this stuff on their own. It can only be the Russians. And there's a very long history of this sort of it's much more than just paternalistic thinking. There's a very long history of this incredibly boneheaded sort of thinking in the US. I personally trace it back as far back as the 19th century, where this fictitious ailment called drapetomania was invented, with the claim that any African wanting to be free was suffering from a mental illness, because as we well know, Africans have no human desire to be free. The natural position of an African is supposedly slavery. This happened again in 1930. This was at the peak of the Jim Crow era, at a time where Africans, both in the diaspora and on the continent, where I believe in the US the term was 3/5 of the human being. In Africa, we weren't even classified as humans. In some parts of the continent, like in Southern Africa, Africans were classified as flora and fauna. And in a place like Nigeria, where I come from, Nigeria wasn't even classified as a country under occupation. It was classified as a corporate object owned by the Queen. We're ruled by something called the Royal Niger Trading Company. And in the midst of all that, Africans on both sides of the Atlantic started uniting to come up with some sort of Pan-Africanist thinking. And the US government said it's the Soviets that are behind it. In the 1960s, during the African independence era, which coincided with the civil rights movement, because they were both joined at the hip, it was the same thing. Martin Luther King is a Russian agent, Kwame Nkrumah is a Russian agent, Patrice Lumumba, Fred Hampton, you guys are all Russian agents. In 1985, the apartheid head of Prime Minister of South Africa claimed that blacks are happy in South Africa under apartheid, and the only blacks who aren't happy are those who have had Russian ideas pushed into their heads. So it's like we're in 2024 and this same thing is being rinsed again, that without the involvement of this Russian subversive funding or indoctrination or whatever, these group of people, black people, are just too fundamentally stupid to have any positions, any ideologies, any voices, any thoughts of their own. They can only do something when there's the hand of Vladimir puppeting them.
The biggest way people give up power is by not knowing we have it to start with.
The African institutions themselves, they don't have protection from imperialism. So whenever we are building up an independent when we are building up an independent institution, imperialism will come and attack that institution, and there's no one to protect it. And of course, this is unfortunate. So while the United States on one side is talking about freedom of the press, when it comes to Africa, they don't want that freedom of press in the African continent.
They did this very quietly. And that's because Africans don't really have don't have a voice. There is no platform run by an African. When I say platform, forget even having a platform. I mean, that's too much. Forget platform. There is no channel. There is no creator of African descent who commands 7 million subscribers or followers, 8 million. Nobody. Only comedians like Kabelami and all these sort of people who are making people laugh. If you're harmless and you're making people laugh, for 100%. Or you're doing something benign, Marquise Brownlee, all of these sort of black creators, you can have 10 million followers or 50 million. There is no African or black political commentator. I'm not even say commentator, just somebody who just talks about real societal issues that are of pertinent, urgent interest to the black and African and diaspora community that has a serious following. Why? Because you don't control those algorithms. You think that 100 million Africans on YouTube and TikTok do not want to watch videos about what's going on in Africa? Yes, it's unfortunate, but you are on an American platform. YouTube is an American platform. So at some point, if you're going after the United States, at some point, they're going to come for you. If what you're saying starts hitting too close to home, because you bet your bottom dollar, if what those guys were saying wasn't having any impact, they would have been left alone. The problem is that what they were saying was actually making people think about certain things.
There is this also clear fear of any kind of media that isn't giving a U.S. government perspective on things. And I'm just curious your thoughts on that, because as we see these geopolitical shifts around the world, you do see a lot of people in global South countries really changing their views of the U.S. based on the U.S.'s own behavior, not because Russia's telling them to.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the classic behavior of a dying empire, if you like. When a star is in the process of turning to a supernova, is at its most dangerous, and is at its most irrational. That's what the U.S. is doing. We've seen this in so many ways, not just in Africa, but it seems like it's a recurring motif in pretty much everything the U.S. does with its foreign policy now, where in trying to accomplish one goal, which is to hobble the other guy, it ends up indirectly strengthening the other guy. So, for example, when it tried to, I believe the Secretary of Trade, Janet Yellen, said in her own words that the goal was to hobble China, to stop China from accessing the ability to manufacture a certain type of chip. Guess what? China simply went ahead and found a way. And now, based on the crazy stunts that this great ally of the US that shall remain unnamed pulled yesterday, half of the world is going to be pivoting toward Chinese chips and Chinese electronics, right? So they've essentially sanctioned their own companies. They did the same thing with the sanctions on Russia. They effectively sanctioned Russia. They sanctioned Western suppliers because now they don't have access to Russia's market. Russia simply pivoted toward China and other suppliers. So Russian consumers and the Russian economy is not suffering, but Western interests are suffering. So effectively, they've sort of self-sanctioned, and they're doing the exact same thing in Africa all over again, where instead of trying to show that, okay, if we claim that what narratives being put out by the likes of African Stream are wrong, they're not accurate, that the US is actually a force for good in Africa, this is the evidence, this is what we're doing. Instead of trying to do that, it's, let's ban them. Let's stop people from having access to them. And they don't seem to realize that by doing that, they're just proving our point even further. Because what business it would have been different if Lincoln had said, we are restricting access to African Stream in the US. US citizens shouldn't see it. That's fine. That's America's prerogative to determine what Americans get to see. Right? Because Americans have electoral control over who gets to decide those things for them. But then you are standing in DC and making decisions effectively on behalf of an entire continent. So you are telling a platform like Meta, which has billions of users across the world, to deplatform a news organization based in Nairobi, Kenya. Right? So millions of people, literally millions of people across the continent and across the world who follow African Stream have essentially had that taken away from them by some sort of imperial diktat from Washington. And that only proves the point that we have constantly tried to make, that the US is an empire. It behaves like an empire. These are the actions of an imperialist.
Well, guys, people are dropping like flies. There's another few creators that are on Instagram that I followed, and I was trying to tag them, and then it gave me a warning saying that they're spreading fake news and they've got warnings and strikes, and are you sure you want to tag these people? I was like, what is going on? Multiple African content creators. And I'm saying that it is very scary that a channel can just be wiped off the internet because they have a different point of view.
I mean, do you feel that they're worried, the United States, that is, that they're losing control of Africa? I mean, I think one thing about Africa Stream is it's, produced by younger Africans. It's very on the pulse of younger Africans, the movements that are happening all across the continent, the questions that people are talking about. I mean, do you think there's an element of fear here, not just of what people may do if they are able to access news sources like Africa Stream and others, but what they're already doing, and the fact that Africans and younger Africans are producing their own media to reflect their own experiences, which are obviously, it seems to me at least, moving in a different direction than where America and Europe might like?
I believe that's exactly the problem. What they've been used to is being able to operate almost sort of unopposed in Africa, because for the longest time, the biggest problem Africa faced was there was a huge asymmetry in global information. So as you may or may not know, the entire, pretty much something like 90-something% of Africa's digital satellite television market, for example, is dominated by a single company, it used to be South African. It's now owned by Canal Plus, which is a French company. So essentially, an entire continent's digital television is now owned by some guy in Paris, right? And it used to be owned by some white guy in Joburg, right? So there used to be this sort of very tight control over what information gets into the heads of Africans. So in 2022, for example, when the decision was made to sanction RT, stop RT from broadcasting in Europe and the US, RT, as you may or may not know, was also stopped from broadcasting across Africa, even though Africa had no business with any of that. Africa was not involved in the sanctions package on the Russians, but because the RT feed that fed MultiChoice, which is the sort of monopoly entity on the African continent, came from a European supplier, and the European supplier had to follow EU sanctions, that happened, basically. So effectively, you've had one guy in Washington turning switches on and off for 2 billion people or so, which absolutely should not be the case. But now, because of the rise of the internet and social media, and the use of social media by platforms like African Stream, which, as you know, even though it has a native website, it focuses almost exclusively on social media platforms, right? Which is why it's so influential. We've been able to leverage that and get this message out to people. And for the first time, people are seeing that this is not just like some airy-fairy ivory tower narrative that, some Cornel West type person says on CNN, that I can actually connect to this. I can see why my economy is depressed. I can see why I don't have jobs in my economy. I can see why, despite so and so $1 billion of aid that supposedly is coming into my country, I can see why I don't see any evidence of it. I can see why some US ambassador will claim that they're investing $10 billion into the railway corridor in my country, and there are no jobs coming out of it. I can see why now, because there's this platform that is showing me that this is what has been done elsewhere, and this is what is being done here, and that's the difference. And for the first time, I can connect with it and make that connection, and then that turns into political action, which apparently is not what the US government wants to see. But I don't know what to tell them, because unfortunately for them, unfortunately from their point of view, the truth is this is the world's youngest population. When you have that kind of young population that now has, relatively cheap, widespread, high-speed internet access, it can only ever be a matter of time until that information equalization takes place, and then you'll start to see real political movements toward the outcome that you don't want.
US big tech corporations have basically taken over the world. In almost every single country on Earth, the digital infrastructure upon which the modern economy is based is owned and controlled by a small handful of technology corporations largely based in Silicon Valley in California. These big tech corporations, these monopolies, have enormous control not only over the economy of the United States, but over the global economy. And increasingly, this system is looking more and more like neofeudalism. The feudal landlords of medieval Europe, who controlled all of the land and turned almost everyone else into serfs who worked on the land that they didn't own on behalf of those landlords. Today, we see a contemporary equivalent.
If you don't have a competitor to Google, a competitor to Uber, a competitor to Facebook, a competitor to Apple, a competitor to Amazon.com, if every German or Italian or French or British producer has to go through those cloudalists in order to sell their stuff, even in Europe, and Amazon makes 42 billion every year only in Europe and pays zero tax, zero. Well, you're gone, you're finished.
Now, Amazon is a perfect example of how these US corporate monopolies have become neo-feudal lords. Unlike monopolies of the 19th and 20th centuries that controlled a single market, Amazon controls a huge part of the marketplace itself. Not just a single market, but the marketplace. Amazon creates and destroys entire markets. And at the same time, Amazon actually takes the ideas of other businesses, copies their products, and then sells those products on Amazon and rigs the algorithm so its products show up first.
This is exactly what white creators do on social media with their cultural appropriation of black ideas, creativity, and innovation. The rigged algorithms could explain why black voices are consistently suppressed on all platforms, because we don't own them. Though this could backfire for them and be a blessing in disguise, forcing us to adopt a more insular, China-like approach to the internet, ultimately diminishing white America's dominance with a black-owned platform. Nevertheless, this challenge presents an opportunity for black communities to invest in our own educational institutions and infrastructure. Yet among us, the house slave class continues to serve the interests of white establishment, further complicating the task of building a self-sustainable system for the future.